Ladies and gentlemen, to tell you more about her latest novel, The Geneva Trap, please welcome Dame Stella Rimington.
Actually, I have to tell you that Sydney is my favourite city in the world. I find it slightly embarrassing to say that, actually, because I'm supposed to say that London is my favourite city in the world, especially as we've just been having the Olympics and we're all feeling frightfully patriotic. My first career was as an archivist. That was what I decided to be when I left university. And I was an archivist for about 4 years or so, 4 or 5 years. And then I got married and I gave up work altogether, as people of my generation really were expected to do, you know, to go off with their man. And my man had been appointed as a diplomat to the British High Commission in New Delhi. So I gave up work altogether and went off to be a diplomat's wife, thinking I would never work again. And then, lo and behold, one day in the British High Commission in New Delhi, somebody sidled up to me and said, "Do you want a job?" And I found that I had joined MI5. And I stayed in MI5 for the next 27 years or so, rising up from being a part-time clerk typist, which is the job I'd been offered in Delhi, to becoming Director General, which was really rather unexpected as far as I was concerned, and as far as most people were concerned, I think. I try to keep all my plots very up to date. With the Geneva Trap, I've sort of returned to the Cold War, but it's not the Cold War as we know it. But it has got 2 Russians in it, and one is a baddie and one is a goodie. I just want to introduce you very quickly to the goodie Russian. And this, what's happening here is that the head of the MI6 station in Geneva plays tennis regularly at the tennis club. And here he is getting dressed after playing tennis. He was standing in front of the mirror adjusting his Traveller's Club tie when he's very smart, like all MI6 officers, I tell you. Adjusting his Traveller's Club tie when he saw the reflection of a man in tennis whites emerge silently from between the line of lockers behind him. Something about the man's sudden appearance made his back crawl. He swung round to face the man, surprised that he hadn't realised that there was anybody else in the room. The tall figure had prominent cheekbones and dark hair brushed back from a high forehead. He walked straight towards White, that's his name, Russell White, who drew back slightly against the mirror as he approached. The man just brushed by him before turning towards the door to the courts. As he passed, he said in a low voice what sounded to White like, "I want to speak to Liz Carlyle." "I beg your pardon," said White to the man's receding back, wondering if he'd been mistaken for somebody else. The man turned with his hand on the door and said again, "I want to speak to Liz Carlyle. Only her, no one else." Then he left the locker room and the door swung shut behind him. Russell White stood for a moment, fingering his tie and thinking hard. He could have sworn he'd never seen that man before. What did he want? And who on earth was Liz Carlyle, if that was what he'd said? So, for those of you who haven't read any of these books, Liz Carlyle is the female MI5 officer who appears through all the books. And I suppose it was inevitable that when I decided that I wanted to write novels, I was going to have a female heroine. And I suppose, it was inevitable because I'm a female, but it was also inevitable because of my own history in MI5. When I joined MI5, it was a very male-dominated world. There were 2 career structures, 2 tiers, really, of career. One was for the men and one was for the women. And the women could never really rise beyond being assistants. We were called junior assistant officers. And our job was to assist the men. While the men went out and did this kind of sharp-end stuff and gathered the intelligence, the women basically were supposed to stay back at their desks and sort the papers and, do all the stuff that you needed to do to keep everything in order. But anyway, I decided when I was going to start to write these sort of stories, I was going to rescue the spy story from the men, just as, in a sense, we had rescued the intelligence world from the men as well. So I had to have a woman heroine. And so I created Liz Carlyle, who, as those of you who've read any of these books will know, is a sparky, lively, mid-30s intelligence officer. And she is somebody who likes to get to the bottom of all her operations. She is a modern MI5 officer, though. She doesn't have any of the restrictions I had. I mean, it's taken for granted now that women in the service will do all the intelligence gathering, the sharp-end work of the service. And so she gets herself very embroiled in all kinds of operations. When I first started these books, I thought it was going to be a book. I had absolutely no idea that I was beginning a series, which is what it has now become. So I thought Liz Carlisle was a kind of one-off. But, of course, she isn't. And not only does Liz Carlisle go on, but the people in her group go on. So Geoffrey Fane of MI6 started off in the first book, and he's still going strong. And he's another one, actually. Geoffrey Fane is I must say, I do write Geoffrey Fane slightly tongue-in-cheek, because MI5 and MI6, although they work very closely together, are slight rivals, and they do have completely different cultures. And we always regard MI6 as being, you know, the ones dressed in the smart suits with the silk handkerchiefs and the polished brogues, and Geoffrey Fane is part of that. And Geoffrey Fane has got a sort of rather interesting relationship with Liz Carlisle, because he's separated from his wife, and he really rather fancies Liz Carlisle, but he can't stop patronising her. And this is my take, I suppose, on all the men who patronised me during my working life. But there are, I mean, I have to say to the men here, it's not all about insulting the men. There are some really good men in the books as well.